For those of you who arrived yesterday, I hope you slept well. Oh, did they tell you that we have melatonin and sleeping pills at the help desk too? They forgot. This is a full-service institution. What do you need? You know, we have. Actually, that's... Yitz, in his remarks yesterday, defined the transition in history as a transition between different manifestations of God. God chooses to change. In the first stage, you don't have to believe, you know, because God makes you know. It's there. In the second stage, God chooses to get closer, in Yitz's terms, by hiding God's face. In stage 3, God chooses to be closest to humanity by becoming internal and one with you in your experience and ceasing to be completely an agent who changes history. What changes over time is God's decision to the extent to which God places God's self within the context of human life, or more accurately, within the context of history and nature. What happens, however, and this is one very profound and meaningful possibility. What happens, however, if what has changed over time is not God, but what has changed over time are human beings? And I think that was part of what even was behind your question. And that goes multiple ways. What happens if God is involved in history, or God is known because that's what people are wired to know? And what changes over time is not whether God does or does not do miracles, whether God does or does not change history, but what changes over time is the human ability or perception of the reality with which they see. And then, actually, if you lived in the year 70, or actually if you lived in the year 1300 BCE, you would tell a completely different story. Actually, if you were you wouldn't tell a different story, actually. Because if you lived in 13th century BCE, you would be a 13th century BCE person. What we know, what we see, is shaped by the plausibility structures which our environments create for us. We don't know things independent of our plausibility structures. The social, the world view, what we assimilate, what we see, it's not just tools. It's not like, here, I see something. I'll give you just a very mundane example, which, have you all read The Heretical Imperative by Peter Berger? If you haven't, put it as a must-read. Phone. Take a phone. The Heretical Imperative by Peter Berger. In particular, the first chapter is a critical chapter for you to read. Like, you could take a phone, take this phone, and transport it to another time, to a person completely wired differently than you. And since you can't do that, give it to a baby. Now, one of the interesting things is that some babies instinctively, as my granddaughter knows, and here you could all see her picture. That was the real purpose. Did you see it? I have another one. 1 second. We could go on for a while. No, but if you give it to her, she actually knows now that there's a button. And you'll see children very early on know how to use. They're even going to learn that, they even learn that this is not this is the way you move windscreens. Right? This is like, so you say to them, no, and look, it's like they don't know what you do. It's like, what it means. But when you actually give them the phone, the notion that they could talk to you without seeing you is something that they don't, it's another stage. That comes way after knowing how to use this. That's why, like, an iPad is easier for a child to maximize their use of than an iPhone. Because there's another feature here. There's somebody away from them whom you actually have an ability to talk to. Now that, it's not simply a technological change. It's a rewiring of consciousness, of what communication means, of what's possible, of how I see things. Now, what modernity and antiquity are about could be about a shifting role in God, but it could also be about a shifting in the rewiring of the human condition. Please sit. And the human condition is not created in a vacuum. It's created within social structures which reaffirm, which strengthen, which validate that which you believe and that which you know and that which you understand. Now, there's always individuals who are the lone individual, who breaks with their reality and ultimately helps society shift its plausibility structure. But until that lone individual doesn't get up and try to shake, and very often the shaking doesn't work. Look at the prophets. They shook and shook and shook, and then no one, it didn't catch until a couple of 100 or 1,000 years later. But there is the possibility of change, but we think within the structures that are provided for us. We can't think outside of them. The ancient person knows God because that are the only categories. The category with which you assimilate an event is by definition given to you within a structure which says, that happened because, and the association is made. Now, I'm not arguing what happens in fact. Whether it was or was not, who's getting it right or wrong is a separate question. The question is, however, what you experience. And if a pre-Holocaust, or if a 70th century CE Jew after the temple would be parachuted or time traveled somehow to a post-Holocaust world, he would interpret, or she would interpret, the experience in very similar terms. Evidence of that would be, anybody have an idea? Does anybody know somebody who does that? Take, for example, one of the features of religious life is that in certain times and with certain individuals, it succeeds in creating a system of consciousness which is impervious to time. And you could meet people, and I'm not saying they're ancient and primitive, but you could meet people walking amongst us all over who would be no different from a person walking in the year 70 or in the year 1300 BCE, and their interpretation of the event is absolutely the same. The one thing that they could never even imagine is a notion that God is not involved in history. Of course everything that happens comes from God. That's self-evident. And when you live, and it's far easier, the more you live within a social environment which affirms that belief, which makes that belief self-evident, the more difficult it is for you to ever even perceive a different way of seeing things. And so what changes, one possibility, as it's argued, is what changes is God's role changes. God is making an active decision to be a different God as the human condition matures to a different role of responsibility in carrying the sacred task of Tikkun Olam. What Peter Berger and other analysts of the modern condition posit is that God has not changed at all. What has changed is the way human beings look at reality and what we perceive. And the argument of the orthodoxies of religion, or the people, or religious leaders of certain religious denominations, whether it's in Judaism, Christianity, Islam, whatever they may be, is how do we maintain a certain plausibility structure? How do we maintain, and to do so, we actually have to maintain a social structure in which you continue to think the way you used to think. Because God hasn't changed, all that's changed is you have less faith. What's wrong with you? So you experienced a Holocaust, and I'm not being vulgar. You think you know how God acts? You think you could comprehend the infinite nature of the divine? To reach a position where you could actually say God wasn't there? Who the bleak do you think you are? And when you have a social structure which reaffirms that environment, and you have a way of life which reaffirms and trains you regularly to feel the gap between you and God, you are trained to never, ever take the leap to say, excuse me, I could tell you where God is, etc. But for most people, and for most people in this room, and I'm not calling us, and please don't mistake me, I'm not calling us the enlightened ones. I'm not. I'm just calling us us. And I don't even know how ussy we are. Because there's a lot of us's in this room. A lot of different us's. But one of the assumptions I always like to make is that I represent the vast majority of the human condition. And as long as I'm president of this institution, I can get away with it. Okay. It's my little myth or plausibility. But I don't even have a clue. But one of the things about a lot of us is that we're living in a different reality. And Peter Berger describes that reality in beautiful terms, and I'd like to just briefly echo his words for you. That the nature of the world in which we find ourselves is one in which fate, which he defines as the primary category of the pre-modern condition, fate being that you're living in a world of givens. That which is inevitable. That which is the only option you have. Your choices are limited, and your ability to effectuate those choices are limited. Technology creates individuality or individualism in the sense that it creates an empowerment and an ability of the human being to alter their fate in ways that were unparalleled at any other period in human history. The experience of being able to alter your fate creates with it, by definition, the reality of choice. Your agency enables you to imagine different places to be. And technology does not just alter your perception of health, your ability to fight disease, it gives you choice of food, it gives you choice of jobs, it gives you a choice of where to live. And as you have choices of where to live, if your social environment creates a plausibility structure, it creates the framework within which you think, then the different places within which you live are also creating with them parallel worldviews, parallel ways of thinking. Nothing is given. At every point, you have to choose. And at every point, there is a competition for what you choose, over what to choose, over whom to be. Now, the human being doesn't always like to live in such isolated oneness with perpetual choices, so we create groups in which I could actually use the term us. Because I don't want to feel completely bizarre here. I don't want to feel alone and I want to feel like I'm normal. So I create or choose to live in a social structure in which I'm normal. But you choose to come here. And I choose the places within which I live. And as a result, we don't just have human beings who get to choose their jobs. You actually even get to choose your ethics. And you certainly get to choose what you believe or do not believe. And there is no inevitability or fate in the perceptions that you have anymore. And as a result, when you experience a Holocaust, or when you experience a death, or you experience a pain, what you believe or don't believe becomes far more complicated. And for some, the solution is, I need to take you away from your us. And for some, the pain of being there is so great that I don't want that freedom, which comes with responsibility. I don't want that doubt and I don't want that loneliness. And I might choose to go into a place which is an island in time, impervious as possible from the choices that modernity requires of us. As Peter Berger argues, for pre-modern man, heresy is a possibility, usually a rather remote one. For modern man, heresy typically becomes a necessity. Or again, modernity creates a situation, a new situation, in which picking and choosing becomes an imperative. You have no choice but to choose if you're part of us. You might think you're not, but you have no choice. Heresy no longer stands out against a clear background of authoritative tradition. The background has become dim or even disappeared. As long as that background was still there, individuals had the possibility of not picking and choosing. I could just follow. They could simply surrender to the taken-for-granted consensus that surrounded them on all sides, and that is what most individuals did. But now this possibility itself becomes dim or disappeared. How can one surrender to a consensus that is socially unavailable. It's really a remarkable book, by the way. That is the human condition. There are 47 ketchups that you have to pick from. And there are 700 religions and 4,000 answers to questions and approaches within each religious tradition. And where are you going to stand? And who are you going to be? Now, some people, as I said, find it exhausting. So what they do is they find a rabbi and they say, you choose for me. And part of the question, can I be a good Jew and not believe in God, when you come to the rabbi is, could you just you solve it for me? Or as you said very beautifully, that maybe the question is, am I good enough? I liked your description of the question, am I good enough? And if you say I'm good, it's like, just give me the peace. It's not even the question. It's why you want the rabbi to answer it for you. But us usually don't have rabbis like that. Others look for a rabbi who will free us from the myth of ever having to make a decision. And then we delude ourselves into believing that that rabbi doesn't make choices. That we could somehow escape the modern condition by finding a rabbi who thinks that they're living in 16th century Poland. So if I find a rabbi who thinks that they're living in 16th century Poland, then I could somehow be connected to their source, to their plausibility structure, to their source of knowledge. It's an interesting, and again, I want to be very clear. You can't fully incorporate the modern condition and make fun of that choice. Not at all. It's just not us. Now, in the world of faith that us struggle with, the question is whether to choose this plausibility structure of believing. Now, obviously, as I spoke about yesterday, different dimensions of it, or Yitz offered a certain reading and you all know multiple others. You all have some version of faith that you're more comfortable. Faith means, you might believe in a deity who exists as an independent being. You might believe in a deity who is the power within you. You might believe in a deity who creates the world and watches. You might believe in a deity who is there to help you in times of need. You might believe in a deity who aspires for you. You might believe in a deity who cries with you and suffers with you. You might believe in a deity who is a source of inspiration and who's a source of light. They're all out there. And you like the answer to the extent to which it mirrors some chord within your religious soul. My task today, and most of the teachers during this conference, aren't going to address what should you believe in. That's your business. The process of learning is not our. We don't want to take that responsibility. We're a framework for you to engage in your own private discourse, not attempt to meet your fancy by mirroring that which you already know, or by mirroring the choice that you already found. That would be impossible for us to even attempt to walk that path. This is just a structure for you to do your work, and to do work which is a lifetime of work. Lifetime of work. But within the context of this modern condition, in which God doesn't change, but the human being has, and God either was never there or is always there, and it depends on the structure of thinking that the human being brings to that issue. When you have to choose, one of the questions that us ask, or that hinders the process of creating a life of faith, is that if I choose the presumption of faith do I have to leave my brain behind? Do I need a lobotomy in order to be a person of faith? Now, there's a whole bunch of books. They're like, everybody loves buying them. They're like bestsellers. I wish people thought my book was as interesting. I actually think it's more interesting. But in any event, the God delusion, God is not great, all trying to prove to you, basically, and tens of others, that those who want you to believe in God are basically requiring of you to have a lobotomy. You're an idiot. You're an idiot. Now the question is, to what extent, I'll stop. We'll edit this afterwards, right? This will go into the blooper version. To what extent is that true? And I would argue that for many of us, if to believe, whatever it is, to even enter into the conversation of belief, the presumption is that I have to have a lobotomy, I'm not even going to go into that room. I'm not there. Don't even talk, I don't even want to engage in God talk. A life of faith is closed if what a life of faith assumes is that I have to give up on that which I accept as my reason. Now, it's very interesting. In much of classic medieval religious thought, one of the dominant, and it actually becomes an important part of Christian thinking, is that what religion provides, that when you are a person of faith, you actually have an alternative source of truth. Faith actually redeems you from being an idiot. If you actually believe that the world evolves around the sun, you're an idiot. You're giving in, possibly, to the devil's manipulation of your sensory perception. For how could the earth evolve around the sun when the center of the world is the earth? That would be to undermine the divine human covenantal drama. You're an idiot. The devil tempts you. I'm going to free you from your idiocy. And religion provides an alternate truth. A parallel of that, in different terms, is the debate going on in the United States today. Does religion provide an alternative science, which is an alternative? And in an environment which is supposed to separate between church and state, why can I not teach within my public school system creation, not as religion, but as what? Science. I understand I'm not teaching religion in school, but why can't I teach another science? Why not? And it's at least a legitimate argument. And what's important to understand is that from the perspective of somebody who is a person of faith, there is no violation of state and religion in that request. No more than thou shalt not murder is a violation of state and religion. But then it also comes to questions of, what about abortion? And what about marriage? We're going to come to this on Monday night. The complexity of creating a public environment with people with very, very diverse religious perspectives. And the myth that the United States is just fine and simple, as distinct from Israel, is something that we're going to talk about in much greater depth on Monday night. And how do we deal with that, both in the United States, Canada, and Israel? But if, for those of us who hear it, if I have a different notion that God and faith could never provide for me a counter source of truth, or if to do so I have to ignore and leave my other source of truth, then free me from religion. Is that the choice that we have? As Jews, how do we participate in that conversation? What is a position of faith on the question of the relationship between faith and reason? What is a position of faith? What does God require of me? For I believe for many of us, the choice we will make whether to enter into a religious tradition or a life of faith, to open our souls to those possibilities, will be profoundly determined by the baggage we believe we have to carry. And if the baggage we have to carry is too problematic, we're just not going to go there. And that's why very often, when I speak about, or when others speak about a pediatric faith, when you get locked into a certain place of this is religion or this is what it must be, we end up robbing ourselves of choices by the choices that we make. And that one of our challenges is how, within the modern context, do we expand our thinking so that we can have much deeper and more sophisticated choices available to us. In doing so, I would like to, as I deal with this question of faith and reason, and what are some of the voices in our tradition, I want us to take a journey into the life of faith of Maimonides. He's going to be our guide this morning. We're going to walk with him. Before I do so, I want to make a distinction, which I hope will be helpful for you. And that is the distinction between rational and reason, a distinction that Thomas Nagel makes. The notion of the rational is associated with a claim of objectivity. When you say that this is rational, there is an attempt to state this is the world as it is. And it is universalizable. It's not just me. It's not just me that doesn't think that the world was created 5,783 years ago. It's not just me. It's not like when I say yes, it's rational. Yes, here there's and again, I'm not going to get into science because as a Hartman, I never had to understand any of that. I just had to allow that somebody did, and I follow them. Simple. Yeah, there's a dinosaur. Yeah, and I don't believe that there's some huge conspiracy to somehow doctor all the carbon tests and the ways in which we could test the passage of time to make things look billions of years when they're not, just to test the faithful. When I say X or Y is rational, it's not just rational for me. And it's not just even rational for me within my social plausibility structure. It's rational. 1 and 1 is 2. Whether I'm here, whether yesterday, up, down. Murder is wrong today for you. Yes, for that society. That's the category of the rational. And therefore, it's not by accident that Kant, in his categorical imperative, when he speaks about the notion of the ethical, speaks and links it intimately to the category of universalizability. Act in such a way that you would want all people to act. And it's not just act all people at all time, that you could see. It's not about me. It's about what is correct. That's the theory of the rational. Now, it doesn't mean that because something is deemed to be objectively correct, it doesn't change. There might be a moment when enlightenment comes, and there's an argument that's offered, and there's arguments that are offered for the progression, and you move to a new place of the rational. You don't say the word, "It's rational to me." You do say the term, "It's reasonable to me." There's another category in which we all have various categories of reasonableness, but we don't assume that they're universalizable. We recognize the social context, the personal choices that we make. They're mine. Now, I feel very committed to them. They define my life and prioritize some of my most important decisions. But I recognize that there's a difference between rational and reasonable. I'm just going to say this sentence, and I hope it'll be understood, and I will elaborate on it later. The great discussion in the public discourse about religion is about the relationship between faith and rationality. Within the Jewish community, the great challenge we face is the relationship between faith and reasonableness. And I'm going to explain as I move forward. And actually bringing that awareness to a public discourse can be an important contribution that the Jewish community has in the relationship between faith, reason, rationality, and the place of religion within our societies. But let's begin to walk a little bit with Maimonides. Actually, do you know what? I'm going to take a slight break. Are there any questions up till now? This was the introduction. Yes, please. I'll repeat the question.
When you talk about the modern condition, I was inferring to what you said that this is recent. So it seems to me that
no, it's not recent. This starts with in the middle of the 18th century.
Why not back even further? Because people have progressed.
Again, it could have been. The question is, when did modern conditions start? And every it's a very good question, and you could have hundreds of different answers to it. The point that where people begin to see the significant difference is beginning with with the creation of modern nation states, with the beginning of technological development, and they usually locate it somewhere within the 18th century. That's the place where they feel that it wasn't just simply a progression, there was a break, a different category begins to be created. But as on any continuum, it's the perception of a break, when you're right, when there is a continuum, to identify it is difficult. But it doesn't really matter when it started, as long as now we're aware of the fact that we're in another place. Yes, please, sir.
Okay, it's the difference between rational and reasonable. I really don't understand that. I would say from what you're saying that to be rational, you would have to have an infinite scientific knowledge, and then what's reasonable to you is rational. Is that right or not?
No, I'm not saying that to be. I didn't use the term to be rational. Thank you. I'm talking about rationality.
Well, that's
rationality. The definition of the rational is a definition of that which mirrors an accurate perspective of the world as it is. not my take on it. And we make distinctions between, like, when I see you, I'm not saying that this is my perception, it's my inner bias to want to believe that I'm talking to you right now and giving a lecture. No, this is the world as it is. Now, sometime, it could be that somebody, and in epistemology, people, they play these games, say, it could be, Donniel, you're actually sleeping right now. And if you wake up, you'll find that you were giving a lecture to yourself. So there is the possibility of mistake, but the possibility of mistake is countered by evidence. That there is a rational world. That's one, and we aspire to, we don't know all of it. But there are objects which we know. And when we know them, we don't say we know them to me, or subjectively. It's as it is. While there are things which have to do with reasonableness, where we're less certain. Our feelings are, yes, I'm not making an objective claim for all. I live and aspire to live in an egalitarian family. I've raised my daughters to demand of the world and to demand of their tradition a complete and total equal space for themselves within that tradition. I'm fully aware of the fact that that's what within the structures of my reasonable life, not necessarily my rational life. I'm aware of the fact that somebody could choose a very different valued life. But that women should not be beaten is not a question of what I think women should. It's reasonable to me that women should not. I make a distinction between two careers, how you build a family, the choices and the lifestyles even the term lifestyle are all categories which pertain to reasonable. But there's also a category of the rational, which goes beyond, and it pertains to ethics and it pertains to science. Science is not about to me. Even though there are scientific advancements, we leap from the rational to the rational, not living in a perpetual existence of the subjective. I hope that was. Yes, please.
I'd like to focus back on your earlier talk about choices. I'm a male, had no choice in that. I was born in the latter part of the 20th century, I had no choice in that. I was born in the United States, I had no choice in that. In other words, three of the most binding and limiting things about me are things that I didn't have choices about, but I don't live my life thinking about that. So I'm wondering whether our idea, the modern idea that we actually have choices is more hidden than we think it is, and we really don't. There's not that much choice, but we have a perception of choice.
It's a very good question, but let's even see the fact that you don't have infinite choices doesn't. Let's even start here. You're a male. What does that mean? Does that mean who you should marry?
I can't give birth.
Okay, I said I didn't say again. Remember, I know there aren't infinite choices. You're a male. What does that mean? What does it mean about the way you should act, who you should marry, what tasks you should take? A lot of things which would have been self-evident just in the word male prior to this generation. Now, the term, what is your sexual preference? Take the term. What's your religious preference? Take the term. When to get married, to whom to get married, what to do with your life, how to give expression to your male-kite, maleness. All of these are new features that if you went 400 years ago to a village and they wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about. What am I talking about? Get up in the morning, get to work, do your thing. There was an A, B, C, D, and even then there was choices. But it's nothing. This is what they're speaking about. Obviously, there's never infinite choices. That's correct. And there's a lot of things. You also live within a social structure which guides for you a lot of the things that you assume. And very often, we live in social structures in which faith is not the default, faith is impossible. And one of our challenges is to be sometimes honest enough to look at the heresy which might be forced upon us as the presumed sense of what enlightenment is about. You're absolutely correct. But there is a test, and before you choose to be a person of faith, you have to feel that the baggage that it requires of you is a baggage that you want to carry. I saw your hand, and then I'm going to go. Please continue.
Okay. I would like to read 2 lines to you and then ask you a question. The intensity of the event of this historical moment moved people in a way that defied rational comprehension. At that moment, my family and I realized that our future could no longer be in North America when the fate of the Jewish people was being determined by what was taking place in Israel. In this statement, someone said, "We as the Jewish people defy rationality." Isn't that part of our quest?
The person whom you're quoting, no, we defy, not rationality. I think we defy what's reasonable. What would have been reasonable would be for us to check out. What would have been reasonable would be for us to give up on history. What would have been reasonable would be for us to be frightened people who run away from responsibility and go to the North Pole. We are a people who don't defy the rational, but we redefine the boundaries of the reason. But let's now go. I know. I was raised, that was my Bible. No. I was raised on it before it was written. Turn please now with me. Let's just read a few lines from Maimonides. On this page. Know that our shunning the affirmation of the eternity of the world. Everybody there? This comes from Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, Part 2, Chapter 25. Know that our shunning the affirmation of the eternity of the world is not due to a text figuring in the Torah according to which the world has been produced in time. Read it again to yourself. Meaning, we don't deny. Here Maimonides is arguing not with Darwin. He's arguing with the prevalent, perceived, rational argument of his time, which was the belief that the world is eternal and not created. Living in the Middle Ages, in particular in an Islamic culture which was the dominant and most sophisticated religion of the time, everybody else was in the Middle Ages with the exception of the Muslims, who were in the modern world in the Middle Ages. Here it is. Aristotelian thought teaches that the world cannot be created. And the argument of Aristotle is actually grounded in a principle of faith, because the notion of creation assumes a God who would choose to be involved in the physical, which according to Aristotle would be to make God not God. If God is interested in you, God's not God. That's Aristotle's claim. For God to be really God, not only could not God not be within you crying in Auschwitz, but God doesn't even know about you. Because to know about you is to know about that which changes and which is incomplete. Who are you? And therefore the assumption of the creation of the world is to create a God who by definition does that which is ungodlike. Did that come out? You understand what it? And that's why Aristotle says, the world, therefore intellectually the world has to be eternal, because there could have been no one at a time which moved it from one point to the next. He didn't know yet about Big Bang and about the process of evolution. That didn't dawn on him, that there might be a progression and development. He didn't know about that. So therefore, to move from nothingness to something required an agent which is defined as a God, but that act itself counters God's divinity. That's Aristotle's claim. So now Maimonides is asking, do I have to believe in that which Aristotle is claiming is the truth? And he says, I want to tell you, the reason why I reject Aristotle is not because the Bible said the world was created. 1 second. I thought that's what I'm supposed to do. I thought as a religious person I'm supposed to lift up scripture and to say what? This is what? This, my book of science, is what? Bible. That's my book of science. Bible is a book of science. That's what I'm supposed to know. That's what I open when I have a question. So Maimonides says, know that our shunning, the affirmation of the eternity of the world, there's a double negative going on here. Basically, the reason why we don't accept the principle that the world is eternal is not because of a text in the Torah which states that the world was produced in time. What are you talking about? So the biblical text is not what's guiding me. Why? And in one of the more revolutionary texts he says, for the texts indicating that the world has been produced in time are not more numerous than those indicating that God has a body. Actually, it's 2 chapters to thousands, hundreds of chapters who all speak about the fact that God has a body. Who here thinks that God has a nostril? Does anybody here in this room believe that God has a nostril? None of you? None of you? In the Bible, it speaks about charona po, about God's, about God's body, God's face, His anger, His eyes. The whole first part of Guide of the Perplexed basically says all the biblical texts which speak about God having a body. What do you do with them? When it says God lifted up God's hand, what do you think God just did? What does lifting God's hand mean? I'm asking you, what do you think it means? Does God have fingers and does God cut God's fingernails? It's what? A metaphor. It's a metaphor. So you're so wired, look at your plausibility structure. You're so wired that when you see it, you think it's self-evident that what is it? Of course God doesn't have a nostril, and of course God doesn't have fingernails. And any text that says so, it's just what? It's a metaphor, it's a figurative statement. Maimonides says, I looked at all the Bible which believed that God had a body, and I said, what is it? It's a metaphor. Lift God's hand speaks about God's power, and I can't even speak about God's power. So, and Maimonides goes so far to say that all you can really know about God is that which God is not. Negative attributes. I can't even say God has power, because power is limiting. God has to be transcendent of language, etc. But, he says, now what did I do with the God body? You all did it. You did it just like this. And I would guarantee you, most creationists in the world don't believe that God has a nostril. Interesting. But Maimonides is saying, let's look at the move you do and make it an ideological principle of what it means to be a person of faith. For the texts indicating that the world has been produced in time are not more numerous than those indicating that the deity is a body, and by implication I got rid of those, and it would be nothing for me to say that the creation of the world is a metaphor. What, you think that's exactly the way the world was created? What a waste of time in grade 2 when the children had to come home with homework. What was created on the 3rd day? Give me a break. Like, this is what I needed you to know. Oops, you got it wrong. That was the 2nd day. I remember. And it was really hard for me, tests. And I tried to remember all the stuff, and I couldn't remember, and I felt so bad. Because I actually thought, that the tree was on this day, and I got it all mixed up, and I'm a failure. I didn't remember which day the tree was. Could you imagine? Free at last. Grade 2 would be so much freer from all this angst. Like, who cares? It was a metaphor. I should have written, it's a metaphor. If I knew the word, I would have gotten my first A in my life. And then I would have been kicked out of school, but that's something else. Or beaten by the principal.
The A's a metaphor.
It's a metaphor. But in grade 2, you don't think it's a metaphor. That's the thing. Now I know it's a metaphor. And then Maimonides says, it's like, God, look how much time we spent on Narishkeit. And then he adds a line which is so important to what it means to be a person of faith. Nor are the gates of figurative interpretation shut in our faces or impossible of access to us regarding the subject of the creation of the world and time. What does it mean to be a person of faith? To be a person of faith is not to be an idiot. To be a person of faith is to use the gates of interpretation. That's what I do. For we can interpret creation as figuratively as much as we have done when denying God's corporeality, God having a body. And it would probably even be easier to do. For we should be very well able to give a figurative interpretation of those little verses in the Bible and to affirm as true the eternality of the world, the eternity of the world, just as we have given a figurative interpretation of those other texts and have denied that he may be exalted is a body. No problem whatsoever. So why, if I don't have to reject Aristotle, why don't I accept him? Because Maimonides says the world's created. So I don't reject it because it was written in the Bible. Because for Maimonides, what's written in the Bible is not a source of truth, of scientific truth. That's why he doesn't, science and religion, it's not the notion, as they spoke in the Middle Ages, of two books. Religion, faith doesn't provide for you an opposite book, which creates a challenge as to what you do. He explains, why didn't I reinterpret creation? Two causes are responsible for our not doing so, doing this or believing it, and please pay careful attention. One of them is as follows, that the deity is not a body has been demonstrated. Use my terms, please, to give me nachas. It's what? Oh, thank you so much. Tell that to a Kabbalist, might be something else. And in fact, Maimonides tried saying that. And one of the things that people called him on is they said, Maimonides, that might be your notion of reasonable, it's not rational. And Maimonides tries to say that anybody who believes that God has a body has no place in the world to come, and the medieval commentary on the Rambam, the Ravad, gets up and says to Maimonides, there's people far greater than you who believe that God has a body, so don't go pushing me out so quickly. What you think is rational, and that's one of the interesting things, is sometimes what you think is rational, someone else thinks at best is what? Reasonable. You're lucky. Very often they'll think it's irrational. But that's something else. But at the end of the day, you only have to be who you are. Forget the world. We're talking about you. What is your religious life? And Maimonides gets up and says, for me, there is no way in China that I could say that God has a body, because for me, that's the rational. This is what science, this is what truth requires of me, and therefore it's self-evident to me that any text which says to the contrary is what? Is? You got it. You see the shift? When you said if any text that says the contrary is irrational, therefore what do you do with the book? Leave it. When you say every text that says contrary is what? A metaphor, the text never contradicts the rational. Now you understand Maimonides. The essence of the Maimonidean revolution is that there can never be a contradiction between religion and the rational. And any time there's a contradiction between between religion and the rational, you didn't understand religion. Even deeper, I'll give you another term. God is God precisely to the extent that God mirrors the rational and does not undermine the rational. For certain individuals, there is a belief that for God to be God, God provides you a different system of rationality. I'm freeing you from having to go to Darwin. I'm freeing you from having to listen to scientists. Just read this, because hafoch ba the kulaba, turn it over and turn it over, for everything that you want is where? It's in here. That's it. You're safe. My mind says, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? The only reason why I don't accept Aristotle is because Aristotle, for me, however the eternity of the world, has not been demonstrated. If it's reasonable, I don't have to accept it. There could be multiple principles of reasonableness. But that means that one of the voices, and it's one voice, that a Jew could bring to a public discourse of the role of faith in modern consciousness and the choices that we make, is that to be a person of faith is never to construct your own notion of the rational. And that to ask so is to ask of religion to speak on a domain in which it is not only incompetent, but just simply uninterested. Religion is about how you live your life. Religion is about what you do with your life. Religion is about inspiring to do more with your life. Religion is not about giving you a different take on the rational. For that, there is indeed a different book. And as a religious person, I reread my tradition as the human rational enterprise undergoes perpetual enlightenment. And I am never in angst, because never even dawned on me to think that my problem with Aristotle was because the Bible said counter to that. Could you understand the spiritual and intellectual audacity, as well as the freedom that Maimonides is creating, of how you walk in life? And that a Jewish perspective on this question as people of faith is not, I need to keep you out of the public school because of separation of church and state. But it's because our voice is a different voice of how religion and the path of faith works. And you never have to witness what we all witnessed in a Republican primary many years ago, when 12 very intelligent individuals who know better had to find a way not to say what I just said, because if they did, they couldn't get elected. And when they were asked, so tell me about creationism and Darwinism, and they all became intellectual pretzels. One of them tried to say Maimonides. It just didn't, the soundbite didn't work. It just felt, I think creation is a metaphor. You saw like all the television channels going click, 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 click. This principle of the ability, not just the ability, the obligation of a life of faith to be in accordance with the rational, is the guiding principle of Maimonidean religious life. Now, in our tradition, we have others. We have others. This is one, a very, very prominent and dominant one, which should be in your arsenal. And as a result, faith becomes, the choice of faith could become possible. The choice of faith that you might want to make in whatever personal faith journey you want to walk on doesn't require the baggage of the intellectual lobotomy. But Maimonides even goes further. Please turn to page 8. There is a group of human beings, do you all see it? There is a group of human beings, part 331, who consider it a grievous thing that causes, reasons, should be given for any law. What would please them most is that the intellect would not find a meaning for the commandments and prohibitions. Why? Because Torah is a source of its own categories, its own principles of reasonable. It shapes the reasonable. It tells me what to think, and therefore the more I don't understand it, the more it is what? Divine. The more I don't understand it, that's what I need God for. A life of faith is to wire into a different network of understanding, and that's why faith is important. Free me from my own reason, give me a different system, and that's why I much prefer that the whole Torah be perceived to me to be irrational, but really is something that is profoundly rational, but the only way that I see it as rational is through the medium of faith. This is what the leap of faith means. When you take a leap of faith, what are you leaping over? Or where are you leaping towards? What you are leaping over is your sense of the reasonable towards the domain of certainty provided for you by a God who functions in accordance with categories which you don't have access to. And I'm free. So here it's just great. Don't give me any explanations. Don't want to hear it. Because once I start explanations, I'm assuming that the Torah has to live up to what standard? To the standard of reasonableness. At least. Of course it's going to be rational. But now it's speaking to me. Who are you to give a reason? Shh. Just say amen and do. Maimonides, who was a deeply tolerant and pluralistic individual, then says, what compels them to feel thus is a sickness that they find in their souls. A sickness to which they were unable to give utterance, and of which they cannot furnish a satisfactory account. He doesn't say they were wrong, they're sick. For they think that if those laws were useful in this existence and been given to us for this or that reason, it would be as if they derived from the reflection and understanding of an intelligent being. If, however, there is a thing which the intellect could not find any meaning at all, and that does not lead to something useful, it undoubtedly derives from God. Here Maimonides takes on the question of to what extent does religion have to be reasonable? And he argues against the theory which says it just simply does not. Actually, the more you assume that it's reasonable, the less religious it is. Faith, what is the baggage that you carry? The first challenge that Maimonides says is faith doesn't create a parallel system of rationality. Faith is worthwhile only to the extent that it is always in accordance with the rational. And now he goes and says that the essence of the divinity of Torah is that it also fits the human criteria of the reasonable. It is as if, according to these people of weak intellects, man or woman were more perfect than his maker. For man speaks and acts in a manner that leads to some intended end, whereas the deity does not act thus, but commands us to do things that are not useful to us, and forbids us to do things that are not harmful to us. But he is far exalted above this. The contrary is the case. The whole purpose of the Torah, consisting in what is useful for us, as we explained, on the basis of its dictum, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as is this day. And it says, which shall hear all these statutes, chukim, and say, surely this great community is a wise and understanding people. Thus it states explicitly, listen to this and we're going to explain it. Thus it states explicitly that even all the statutes are those dimensions of the Torah which are assumed to be ununderstandable, incomprehensible. Even the statutes, according to Maimonides, will show to all nations that they have been given with wisdom and understanding. Now, if there is a thing for which no reason is known, and that does not either procure something useful or ward off something harmful, why should one say of one who believes in it or practices it that he is wise, understanding, and of great worth? What is Maimonides arguing for? There are two challenges, as I said. The challenge of the rational and the challenge of the reasonable. Most Jews don't think God has fingernails and have overcome the problem of God's nostrils and feel quite comfortable with whatever the scientific community provides for us. One of the problems we face is that we think so, in doing so, we are working outside of the domain of faith. That in doing so, we are somehow secular and not religious. And in so doing, again, defining, taking away from ourselves choices and languages. Maimonides says, I don't understand your dichotomy. God could not be God unless God is rational, and faith in God could not be valuable unless it is always in accordance with the rational. To embrace the rational is not to challenge faith, but it's to make faith essential and or to make faith valuable or worthwhile. And so most Jews somehow got over the creation story and didn't have problems showing their kids Flintstones and didn't feel that this was a great crisis of faith, that there was, yes, dinosaurs. And even in Orthodox schools, we could teach about dinosaurs. And now, that issue, which is more significant within sectors of the Christian community, it's there within certain sectors of the ultra-Orthodox community. But even there, the moves are there to be made. The tragedy of the Jewish community is that we think that in doing so, somehow we're less faithful. A greater challenge we face, though, to the system of faith is not when faith contradicts the rational, but when faith contradicts the reasonable. What happens if I don't believe that homosexuality is an abomination? What happens if I don't believe, or that I don't feel, that commandment X or Y, whether it is kashrut or Shabbos, is reasonable? What happens when I feel that Judaism is foolish? Does faith require, that faith doesn't require of me, or that Judaism can't require of me to be irrational, I understand. And somehow I'm willing to save Judaism from that. But what about the challenge of the rational? In a world of choice, why should I choose to buy into that which is irrational? Why should I buy into something that is unreasonable? Why should I choose to buy into something that's just silly? Forget irrational, it's just silly. Who needs it? Maimonides argues that the standard that Judaism must comply to is that it must be perceived even by the outsider, the nations of the world. The outsider must see it as that which is fundamentally reasonable. That for Torah to be divine, it doesn't just simply have to pass the muster of the rational, it also has to pass the critique of the reasonable. Faith cannot obligate you to be unreasonable. Now, what do you do when it does? Herein lies the question. For Maimonides says, don't worry. All the nations of the world are going to open up this book. They don't know it comes from God. They don't care. They're going to look and say, wow, this is a wise, a wise and what? An understanding people. Whoa. Now, if you open up the book, does every chapter fulfill that criteria? What happens if it doesn't? Maimonides gives us two very important principles. And in dancing between these two principles, we have the essence of the type of religious life he wants to create, and one which I would suggest to you might be worthwhile for your reflection. The first is are there any questions of comprehension? Just comprehension, because I don't want to add this next stage if there'll be time for questions, but questions of comprehension. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now comes an exam. Open up your page. You understand the difference between the rational and the reasonable. You understand Maimonides saying for Torah to be Torah, it also has to fit the reasonable. Now you understand the level that he's demanding? He's reaffirming for you and saying, you don't have to give up even what you think is reasonable. That if you give up what you think is reasonable, what you're doing is you're giving up on the divinity of Torah. In other words, it's not an external struggle, it's an internal one. To live with God, to walk in a life of faith, is to be completely tuned to not only what you think is rational, but also what you think is reasonable. Any less than that is to live in accordance with a human system and not in accordance with a divine system. Yes, please. There were two questions.
Yeah. This is a comprehension question, I think, which is that I'm hearing what you just said, but of course, for a class in our Torah reading this morning, God commanded me to take a perfect red pepper that has no blemish and burn it into ashes, and then mix it with some hyssop and scarlet, and then spritz it on somebody who's in contact with the dead, and now they're pure. How is that either rational or reasonable?
Now, that is exactly what Maimonides has to explain. Thank you for the setup of what we're about to do. Because you're absolutely right. Sometimes you now want to know, Maimonides, what were you drinking? Or is it smoking? What were you smoking? What were you smoking when you read the Bible the last time? A lot of this is nuts. This is simply nuts. So what do you do? What do you do? What?
That is actually nuts.
This book. Okay. It's not like, what do you do? What do you do when what you feel, it's not that the Bible is saying something that contradicts science. It's just boring because it's just not reasonable. It's just silly. The test of silliness is killing religion. Are you passing the silliness test? Now, Maimonides gives us two directions on how to pass the silliness test, or how to solve the problem, which you're just raising. Now, what does he state? Principle number one. I'm first going to state it orally, and then we're going to read part of it in time. A perfect God cannot give a perfect Torah to an imperfect people. A perfect God cannot give a perfect Torah to an imperfect people. Which basically means that question number one is not whether it's reasonable to you, but whether it was ever reasonable. And one of the tests of the reasonableness of Torah was it reasonable at the time in which it was given? This is one move Maimonides makes. Was it reasonable? Now he asks, You spoke about the red heifer. The whole system of sacrifices. What, God needs a bull? Give me a break. You are supposed to read the innermost feelings of my heart, connect, figure out what I'm doing, and get on with it. You need a bull? Spritzing and bloods. And what do you need that whole system for, to the extent that more than half of the 613 commandments are what? Are in the sacrificial system. So Maimonides, exactly, he finishes chapter 31, goes to chapter 32 and says, I have to deal with the system of sacrifices. Because the system of sacrifices undermines completely my whole what? My argument. Here it is. Oh yes, everybody's going to look at this system and say, wow, what a reasonable system. And pluck, I open up and I see sacrifices and I say, you're idiots. God needs it. The smell is somehow pleasing to God? Nuts. It's nuts. What does Maimonides say? Please turn to page 10. Yes, please. That's correct. That's correct. High standard, isn't it? Now let's, again, this is what he's stating. Now beware what your aspirations are, and we're going to come to whether it has to be that. Now it's very possible that it doesn't have to be that high, and I'm going to come back to that. But you read it, you understood it exactly correct. Where there is no presumption of reading it sensitively or loving your own tradition, it just has to sit there and be reasonable and explainable. He says, if God is God, that's what religion has to do. So his first thing he says, exactly, okay, so in order to be honest, let's deal with sacrifices. Chapter 31 leads to chapter 32, and he says as follows. If you consider on page 10 the divine actions, we're going to skip in and out, but you could read it afterwards and you'll see I'm not cheating you. The natural actions of the deities' willy graciousness and wisdom, as shown in the creation of living beings, is found in the gradation of the motion of the limbs, and the proximity of some of the latter to the other will through them become clear to you. What does this mean? Similarly, blah, 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 blah. The brain is an example. You see it 2 lines down? Is an example of the gradation of the motion and the proximity of the limbs of an individual. For its front part of the brain is soft, very soft indeed, whereas its posterior part is more solid. The spinal marrow is even more solid and becomes more and more solid as it stretches on. The nerves are organs of sensation of motion. Accordingly, the nerves require only for apprehension by the senses or for motion that presents but little difficulty, like the motion of the eyelids and of the jaws, proceed from the brain, whereas the motions required for moving limbs proceed from the spinal marrow. As, however, it is impossible for a nerve, in view of its softness, even for a nerve proceeding from the spinal marrow, to move an articulation, the matter was willily and graciously arranged as follows. The nerves are ramified into fibers, and the latter have been filled with flesh, become muscles. Thereupon the nerve, having overpassed the extremity of the muscle, having become more solid, having been commingled with fragments of ligaments, become a tendon. The tendon joins and adheres to the bone, and thereupon, because of this gradation, the nerve is capable of moving a limb. Okay? The basic principle being a nerve. You can't jump from a nerve to what? To the movement of a limb. You can't jump from a twitch of a nerve to a what? To a movement of an arm. What do you need to have? You have to have a process, and again, I have no idea. Actually, hearing my father teach this chapter was always very funny. Because you have to, Hartman, we don't have a clue about it. It's like in any event, it's just like we just sort of assume that he knows what he's talking about. But the basic principle we could sort of visualize. It's like if you're as scientifically inclined as us, there's a different us. Now I'm not us you. Now I'm us Hartmans. Okay, that was different us going on there. But it's like you could sort of visualize a nerve and a bigger, that something had to happen. You had to go from this to the tendon to the got to get bigger and bigger. You couldn't just jump from one moment, from a thought to an act. There had to be a gradation. That in the laws of nature, God assumes or takes into account the need for gradation. And Maimonides gives a number of examples of this in the physical world. And then he skips, go to the bottom of the page. Many things in our law are due to something similar to this very governance on the part of him who governs. May he be glorified and exalted. And now he says, for a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible. Not just for in the physical world, but also for human beings. We can't move from being in one space to being in another space overnight. Therefore, man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all that to which he was accustomed. If this is your plausibility structure, if this is the way you see things, I can transport you to a completely different system. Skip after the italics. At the time, the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world and the universal service upon which we were brought up consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which images were set up, in worshiping the latter, and in burning incense before them. The pious ones and the ascetics being at the time, as we have explained, the people who were devoted to the service of the temple consecrated to the stars. God's wisdom, may God be exalted, and God's gracious ruse, which is manifested in regard to all of God's creatures, do not require that God give us a law prescribing the rejection, abandonment, and abolition of these kinds of worships. For we could not then conceive the acceptance of such a law, considering the nature of humankind, which always likes that to which it is accustomed. And therefore, if you skip down 3-4 lines, therefore God, may God be exalted, suffered the above-mentioned kind of worship to remain, but transferred them from created or imagery and unreal things to his God's own name, may God be exalted. Why do we have nutty sacrifices? Because the Jews at the time were what? Nuts. Still are. That's what Maimonides basically says. A perfect God can't give a perfect Torah to an imperfect people. People are always grounded in a historical context. Nobody could be asked to move, to transition from one reality to another to which they are not accustomed. Consequently, Torah always has to reflect not the reasonableness or not the rationableness of God, but the reasonableness of human beings, and the reasonableness of human beings is always embedded in time. Now we have a decision. And in this decision, there's a difference between orthodoxy, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, renewal, post-denominational, and secular. There's a difference. Maimonides felt that as long as God wasn't arbitrary, as long as there wasn't on the books something that is simply stupid, I could live with it. I can even observe it. My problem is if you're asking me to claim that this makes sense. I don't have a problem doing something that I don't find inspiring. Just don't tell me I'm an idiot. Don't explain to me how this makes sense. I don't do it. Speak to me straight. There's a tradition. There's things that are on the books. As long as if it's irrational, what would I do? I basically have to discover that it's not what? On the books. Because what's in the books, or on the books, is not defined by what? What's in the books. Go back to 225. What's in the books doesn't define what's in the books if it contradicts the rational. Just to give me a sense, Am I just having a lot of fun with myself now, or are you actually understanding? Did that actually rational? I went to rational. Okay. If what's on the books is irrational, it's just simply what? Not on the books. Because then you're asking me to accept that which is irrational for all time. I could, however, do something that's not inspiring to me. So it's not the most, I am not, I love my granddaughter. Changing her diaper doesn't do it for me. Okay, that's not a good example because I know that it's necessary, but still take the example a little bit. I could do for Maimonides as a traditional person, he has no difficulty doing things that aren't meaningful, as long as I know why I'm doing it. If I'm doing it because it's part of a tradition, not because you're arguing to me and saying, yes, this is fulfilling my human existence. Give me a break. God suffers the above form of worship. God suffers it. God hates it. Human beings in the time of antiquity needed it. Now in this case, actually it's not pushing you too much because the temple has not been built yet. Which temple would be built will depend on which religion and which denomination. So you know what? Let's wait. When that happens, we'll resolve the conflict. And whether you yourself will show up in the temple or not, deal with it. Who knows? The great challenge, what Maimonides is trying to get you to think about, is that as Jews, there is never a moment where you ascribe to the tradition unreasonableness, and the context of history or historical explanation doesn't change your behavior, it changes your perception of the unreasonableness of the tradition. This is one move. We're working with Maimonides. Now, Reform or conservative or modern Orthodox, different denominations, could say, excuse me, I also, if something's unreasonable, I want to change it. So if the Reform movement, for example, takes the mention of korbanot, of sacrifices, out of the Siddur, it's a reaffirmation of their statement, I don't even want it on the books. They're still doing a Maimonidean move, but a different one that Maimonides doesn't do, but it's grounded in the same principle. And one of the interesting questions that Maimonides has to ask in light of your question is whether his explanation is sufficient for his standard. Not for the internal standard, I could do it. I could do it. In my family, there's lots of things which we do. I could like them more, I could like them less. In a relationship with my wife or with my children, you get in touch with what with what makes another person feel good, with their sensitivities and sensibilities. And not every single thing has to go exactly the way you need it to go. You could sit there and say, what's really important to you? And I could, okay, this is really, this, I could hear it, I could do this, you could do that, and that's the way you build a relationship. A life with a tradition is also about a relationship. As long as you don't existentially feel that you're an idiot. Now, when do you existentially feel that you're an idiot? What's the answer? That is the choice of the modern person of faith. And where you choose it is where many of us will differ. And that's okay. But to make that choice is what usness is about. But it's about fighting to ensure that faith is possible. It's not about necessarily relinquishing faith, because to be a person of faith means to be an idiot. The path of faith, turn please to page 17. Maimonides' Introduction to Chapter Chelek, Chapter 10 of Tractate Sanhedrin. Last paragraph. Second line, third line. A person, he should rather believe that wisdom exists. Nevertheless, we'll start from the beginning. Even though this is the end we seek, even though we seek to be in the world to come, a person who wishes to serve God out of love should not serve God in order to attain the world to come. that's to do it for a reward. That's not to do it for its own sake. What does it mean to worship God out of love, according to Maimonides? A person should rather believe that wisdom exists, and that this wisdom is or found in the Torah, and that the Torah was given by prophets by God the Creator, and that in the Torah God has taught us virtues which are commandments and vices that are sins. That the Torah is filled with good guidance, guidance which could improve and direct your life. Now, what does it mean to be a person of faith? As a decent person, one must cultivate the virtues and avoid the sins. In Maimonides, the act of faith doesn't create in its highest form a sense of duty. It creates a sense of internalization. When I'm a person of faith, I'm always attuned to my humanity. And that as a person I'm a decent person. I'm compelled, because as a decent person, one must cultivate the virtues and avoid the sins. And in so doing, I will perfect the specifically human which resides within me, and will be genuinely different from the animals. When one becomes fully human, a person acquires, we can skip this back, and then this is the meaning of the verse, 4 lines down. Be not as a horse or as a mule which has no understanding, whose mouth must be held in with bit and bridle. Restraints which prevent animals from acting in accordance with their nature are external ones, like the bit and the bridle. With man, the influence which restrains him are his control of self. When a man achieves human perfection, it, meaning what? Not your faith. It, not Torah. It restrains, meaning what is it? You, which performs, it urges and impels him towards things which are called virtues. It, meaning, are your control of self. The challenge to build a different life of faith, a life of faith in which there isn't an external authority, but in which the challenge of reasonableness defines you or pushes you to create an inner sense of oneness with your tradition. For Maimonides, it could mean, as long as I know that God's not arbitrary, I could do it. For somebody else, it might mean, as long as there is no arbitrary within the tradition. As long as it doesn't violate. If you want me to internalize it completely, then sometimes you're going to have to do certain things with these chapters, and I'm not going to follow those chapters. Sometimes it might mean saving the tradition from itself. And depending on your denominational affiliation or perspective, what you do with the commandment that is unreasonable will differ. And even within your denominations, how much you keep or don't keep will differ. But the journey to create a religious life of faith, in which your path of faith is not seen as a baggage pulling you away from that which is reasonable, but that which dances and completes your sense of who you ought to be. This is the type of religious life that Maimonides calls love of God. In some cases, you're going to have to reinterpret. In some cases, you're going to have to change. In some cases, you're going to be able to tolerate it. But the one thing that's intolerable is to assume that God is not only irrational, but that God is unreasonable. And what Maimonides, with this I'll conclude, and if there's any questions, what Maimonides is basically presenting before us in this unit called Faith and Reason is, as I said at the beginning, we've changed. And whether we're going to be, or whether faith is going to be a part of our discourse, is going to depend on the type of complexity that we bring to the conversation. That's what's going to make the difference. Are you going to be able to walk with God or not is a choice that you have to make. You don't inherit it. It's a choice that you make. And you're going to make that choice dependent on other choices that you make. Principally choices about what you believe faith presupposes. If you believe that faith presupposes a counter system of rationality, you're going to choose not to be a person of faith. Or many of us here in this room will choose to not to be people of faith. And to that, Maimonides says, faith is faith in God only to the extent that it is always in accordance with the rational. And remember, what's in the book is only in the book to the extent that you put it in the book. And you put it in the book dependent on your ability to use the gates of interpretation. And you use the gates of interpretation in accordance with the skill with which you create a dialogue between the rational and the book. And that the deepest meaning of God is not simply that God does not contradict the rational, but that God creates a system that invites you to live a life in which you are totally at one with yourself. That to live a life is to be able to internalize, to reach a place where it's not the yoke of heaven, that's out of fear, but that where the meaning and depth of a tradition inspires you. And that a life of faith is to go on that journey. It's not about replacing the reasonable. It's about fulfilling it. Now, to do so is not something that you inherit. It requires work. It requires work. How many of our children, how many Jews know why kashrut should not be kept, as distinct from maybe a reason why it might be kept? How many people could tell you that kashrut was relevant when we didn't have refrigerators? Because of what's it called? Trega, whatever it is. I'm a Hartman, I don't know those things. Whatever it was. How many know that? And how many actually were engaged in an exercise in which someone asked them, why could this be meaningful? Why could it be meaningful? If we want a path of faith which is in accordance with reason, we need to embark on a community and people-wide enterprise of writing a new Tamei Mitzvot, a new explanation. And in that Tamei Mitzvot, there might be certain mitzvot which just don't make it. There's going to be ones that just don't make it. There's ones which morally we're required to change. There's ones which for some of us, depending on our denomination, we're going to keep or not keep in accordance with our ability to do that which is traditional, even if it's not inspiring. For some, to do that which is traditional is reasonable. For them, some it is not. It's a different sensibility. And there isn't a right or a wrong. It's a journey. But to create that life of faith is in your hands. What Peter Berger says is that to choose is not a choice. To choose is the human condition in the modern world. What I'm arguing is that what you choose is a choice. And how you think and how you wire yourself and what you know and how you work, that is your choice. And we could make far richer choices. In particular, if we redeem the category of faith from the baggage which makes choosing it either too burdensome or impossible. That, it's like which path we're going to take is going to determine the place of faith in the modern world. Now, before we conclude, are there any questions or comments, please, as we conclude for today? Yes, please, Eric.
So far we've been talking about what's in the book and how you interpret the book. What about the existence of the book itself? In other words, divine revelation. How would Maimonides put this in a scheme of rational or reasonable?
Same thing. Use that criteria. The thing is that you never, ever get out of those questions. Because the minute you get out of those questions, you're creating an inferior religion. There is nothing off the table.
But if you conclude it's not rational, to believe it was divine revelation. There's evidence today that suggests
there never will be evidence to suggest that it's not rational. That's anybody in a post-Kantian universe knows that at best you can argue that it's not reasonable. You can never know that faith or lack of faith are all decisions. There is no rational proof to prove that which goes beyond the sensory, and there is no rational proof to disprove a claim that goes beyond the sensory. But you can claim it's not rational, reasonable. If it was not rational, then it would break the whole book. Then you need but you can't. But after Kant, we know that conversation is not. Whether it's both sides who claim the necessity of either argument fail in assuming a level of knowledge to which they have no access. But if you say, okay, the book was not written by God, okay, so what? What happened? What happened? The Talmud wasn't written by God, and it's the most important book in the Jewish tradition. Do you believe that in this book there is guidance as to how you should live with God? That's a completely separate question, independent of the authorship of it. In other words, there's so much more work. There's so many doors that you could walk through if you stop closing them. The amount of doors that we're closing all the time in order to create a claim of this is what must be is what Maimonides is challenging you. Go for it. Go for it. Now someone might say, whoa, Maimonides, you're dangerous. You're destroying tradition. Actually, the way Maimonides is like, in the modern condition, he's actually saying you're going to have to work much harder, Eric, much, much harder. Because there's far more here, more work that could be done than was done beforehand. Yes, please. I'm going to go to people who... yes.
I just want to make sure that I understand that up here is rational, those are facts. Here's reasonable, that's what we accept.
Or yes, that's more subjected to... Those are call them subjective facts.
All right. What? Internal. And the leap of faith is we accept these as reasonable, but the leap of faith is accepting also the rational?
No.
No.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you. No, that's the purpose. I appreciate it very much. Those who ask for a leap of faith ask you to leap to ignore both that which you find reasonable and that which you find rational. Maimonides says a leap of faith does not have to be an internal part of a life of faith. And actually, Maimonides' argument is that a faith in God and the notion of a leap of faith are a contradiction in terms. That a leap, in Maimonides' religion, there is no leap of faith, because to leap over the reasonable or the rational is to move God out of the equation. Because God loves the reasonable and the rational. And the more you ascribe to God irrational or unreasonable, non-reasonableness, to that extent it's less God, so you're believing less. So there is the journey, one journey of faith which we've lived by is that my path, the more faithful I am, the more I'm full of faith and less of science or less of self. It's a zero-sum game. Get rid of self, get rid of what you know, get rid of what you believe, get rid of your morality, and be full of faith. Be faithful. It's going to fill you with all that which you need to know. So get rid of the rational, get rid of the reasonable. Maimonides says, no. Maimonides says, the minute it's faith in God, it has to be in accordance with the rational and the reasonable. And it is Maimonides' theory of faith, which I believe could make a critical difference for enabling a path of faith in the modern condition of choice. For why would we choose to carry a baggage of idiocy with pride? Why would I want to be a Jew if to be a Jew is to be a nut? if to be a Jew is to be an immoral fool. But through a different standard of aspiration, interpretation, and definition of what's in the book, I create a symmetry between faith, rational, and reasonable, which could empower the possibility of choice in the modern world. Was that a little better?
It'll take me all week.
Okay, fair enough. And come back to me more. Yes, please.
I think I want to ask about the locality of reasonableness. At first I thought you were indicating that it was a personal decision. You're making it sound now like it's a global community or perhaps even your vision of what comes next in reasonable assertions. Can you help me understand?
Sure, it could be all of the above. Usually, we don't have a category of reasonable disassociated from the society in which we live. Usually we don't. And it's not by accident that many of us have shifted our perception, for example, on the moral status of homosexuality in light of the societal changes which create for us new plausibility structures. And so sometimes there's the lone individual who sees it first. But very often we see in the midst of the society that we live. And we pick very often societies which reaffirm that. You don't want to live in a society in which you believe that homosexuality is is definitely not an abomination and is a morally acceptable principle, living with a bunch of people who are making jokes and denigrating homosexuals on a regular. You won't do that, or vice versa. You won't know what to do. You won't feel comfortable. So we live in societies in which the moral categories that we feel are reasonable are echoed by that society. Now, very often we choose the societies, and very often the societies help shape for us as well our moral consciousness. Reasonableness is just one thing. It's a recognition of the potential of subjectivity in that process. I could associate the term reasonable to me, to the term. I'm aware of it. It doesn't mean I'm less committed to it. I'm just aware that on certain things I know, and there's other things that I don't know. But some of the things that I don't know doesn't mean that I'm not going to function. I won't die for them. That I won't fight for them. But I do so but I have a level of humility as to what it is that I know. Now, as people in the modern, this distinction between reasonable and rational, is just increasing more and more within the modern condition. The size of the rational is decreasing over time, and as more of it is placed within the domain of the reasonable. Not completely. So it's this. How much rational, how much reasonable, this is what epistemologists are arguing about today. And it's part of that conversation, it's part of what happens in the contemporary moral condition when we're aware of societal impacts on the way we think, when we're aware of the transitions of knowledge, and we become more and more aware of how smaller and smaller the domain of the objective is. That category is the category of the reasonable. Okay? Yes, please. And then Don.
Have you heard this expression, cafeteria religion?
Yes.
Sometimes I hear people speak about it in a very supportive degree. Sometimes I hear what you're saying. We're making choices about what gets in the book. Is I think the expression. Can you express?
Very much so. Peter Berger says whether you like it or not, you're in a cafeteria. Whether you like it or not, there is no such thing as non-cafeteria religion. The only decision you're going to make is if whether you recognize that there's other aisles, or whether you just expand. It's there. You're always making choices. That's the meaning of the heretical imperative. The heretical imperative is you're always making choices. You might make a choice to deny that you're making choices, but that still is a choice. You can make a choice to say, I didn't make a choice. Don't tell me I'm making choices. I want to find other people who are saying to me that my choices aren't choices. They're the way it is. And so you'll build a community to do that. All of the above, but still at the end of the day, that is exactly this For pre-modern man, heresy is a possibility. For modern man, heresy is a necessity. Modernity creates a new situation in which picking and choosing it's who you are. That's the heretical imperative, the defining feature. How you choose, though, now is but once you understand that you're choosing, developing the art to choose well becomes a greater responsibility. Last question, Donald, please.
I'm still struggling with the difference between rationality and reasonableness. And whether we've gotten to an age where reasonableness has just almost completely absorbed.
That's correct.
Rationality. And so, anthropology. We know there are cultures who do certain things that are completely reasonable within their cultures that I think would violate Donniel Hartman's sense of rationality. So,
absolutely. No, you see, there's no, perfectly, now, Thomas Nagel is just one example of someone, he's trying to reclaim the category of the rational. And now, there might be some people who think something is reasonable, which I think is irrational. And at the end, I could simply say the fact that they're doing it and that they think it's reasonable doesn't mean that they're not wrong. Doesn't mean that they're not wrong. But what is true in the human modern condition, we make that move much more rarely. To say of somebody right, wrong, I have the rational, is a language that is a clothing we wear less often. But it's really important not to get rid of it. Because when you get rid of it, for example, you enter into the domain of complete moral subjectivity. Now, we don't enter it into the realm of science. There are certain givens that we accept. We shouldn't enter it also in the realm of ethics. But to know that where it is, how it gets applied, is very often more in the domain of the reasonable than in the rational. Either way, the path of faith could be rejected or feels unfitting to the modern condition, even if it doesn't fit your criteria of the reasonable. Precisely, even more to the extent that you're correct, that we have more and more reasonable, that we very rarely hit the rational. And therefore, it's not sufficient to require of religion that it adapt to the rational. It becomes even more compelling and significant that it adapt to the criteria of the reasonable. And only when the reasonable also has its space, and only when I could look at this chapter and say, I don't know if it contradicts facts, but it's just silly. And to know that you don't have to carry the silly, it's then that faith has wings to enter into your soul in a different way. To ask that question, to be a part of that journey, to understand that that's all we want of you here. And I've said it again, I'm going to say it again and again and again. You're not here for answers. As you're now going to go to study groups, that's not what we're here for. We're not here to solve your dilemma of faith. We're not here to tell you that faith is really X when you knew it was Y, and for us to be straw men or straw women and tell you other than that. We're not going to play that game. That's not what we are. We're your chavrutas. We're here to throw out ideas for you to take, reject, stew it. The great challenge you face, as I said yesterday, is how many doors have you closed? Then study is worthwhile. My hope is that that's what this study here will empower and enable for you. Thank you all very, very much.